Good evening and welcome. Before I introduce our special guest, I'd like to offer thanks to the many individuals who helped make this happen. First, thanks goes to our President and Dean, Thomas McHenry. While Tom could not be here tonight, I am so grateful for his enthusiasm about this event. He has a real excuse. He has a previous engagement with the Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court. We tried to get him to cancel, but you know. Next, I'd like to thank Emily Potts. Emily is presently live streaming us. She is thereby helping us live up to the Vermont Law School motto, which is law for the community and the world. I also want to thank Bill Bond, who is our ever-present AV professional who coordinated everything and is making sure we have lights and sound. Additional gratitude, of course, is due to our communications director, Mary Ellen Applequist, who helped us get the word out. Also, a shout out to both Deans Beth McCormick and Shirley Jefferson, who are here this evening. I also want to thank Trista Kelman, my assistant, and the 4 student ambassadors who have helped out, including by ushering this evening: Sarah Munger, Andrew Bavacqua, Maggie Golka, and Christopher Merritt. They also were kind enough to sit in the front table when no one else would. So now a few words on ground rules. As an institution of higher learning, we often explore complex and controversial subject matters that are at the intersection of law and policy. We invite guests here to speak who are often experts in their fields, who generously volunteer their time to help enlighten us. I hope that we will listen and engage with our speaker tonight when it comes to the questions and answers in the same way that we do in our classrooms, which is with thoughtful inquiries and mutual respect. Now, on to introductions. Tonight we have with us legal expert and CNN analyst Michael Zeldin. We are so fortunate to have him here. Michael has an impressive background in legal practice and commentary. He has a diverse career in the law, including having worked at the U.S. Department of Justice in various capacities, including Special Counsel to Robert Mueller when he was the Assistant AG in the Criminal Division. He's also served as an independent counsel. In that capacity, his team took the testimony of President George H.W. Bush. He served as a deputy majority counsel for the House Foreign Affairs Committee investigation into the holding of American hostages in Iran. He has also worked as a television network legal analyst, including at CNN, for the period from Whitewater through Lewinsky through the Supreme Court decision in Bush v. Gore. Indeed, he covered the Supreme Court oral argument in Bush v. Gore for CBS News with Dan Rather. Michael earned a JD from George Washington University Law School and a Master's of Law from Georgetown University Law Center. Please let's give a warm welcome to Michael Zeldin.
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here in Vermont in the middle of February, I have to say. Especially as a non-skier, you know, there's not much to do for me outside, but it's lovely to be here. It looks more like you need an ice pick. So I'm very, very happy to be here, and I want to make 1 or 2 preliminary remarks. First, to say that these remarks that I make today are my own. Turner Broadcasting and CNN are not speaking here today, just Michael Zeldin in his individual capacity. And I want to say thank you to Professor Taub for having me. I really am delighted to be here. We have family who lives in Rutland who's here and family who lives in Burlington, so we'll get to see them, and that's wonderful too. So I want to say at the outset that when I do these speeches, when I agree to speak, what I typically like to do is send ahead of time my notes to the speakers, to the organizer, and say, this is what I'm going to speak about. Is this what the audience will likely have in mind? Because if she says absolutely not, they're not interested in that, then I have to go back to the drawing board. The problem with the Mueller investigation is that every time I finished my speech, if you will, the preparatory remarks, and we're ready to hit send, something happened, and it was no longer relevant. It had been eclipsed by news. And I covered this, as Jennifer said, I covered this stuff for Whitewater and Monica Lewinsky and Gore v. Bush. And in those days, the story that broke each period lasted about 3 days because the news sources were fewer and they therefore had longer legs. Nowadays, the stories last moments sometimes. You've got BuzzFeed and Political and Huffington Post and a whole range of podcasts and radio that are covering these things, and their reporters are out there working very hard to develop new stories, and those stories develop very quickly. And so what you try to do each day is the best you can to stay current. For me, it's a bit problematic because I do, if any of you have had the fortune or miss to see me on TV, you'll see that I do a lot of Chris Cuomo's show, which starts at 6 a.m. I'm sure most of you are up watching TV at 6 a.m. But that problem is this: the president's tweeting habits. The president likes to tweet in the 5 to 5:45 a.m. range. So again, it means that you've prepared the night before to talk on a particular subject. The president tweets something completely different 20 minutes before you go on air, and it's incomprehensible to you what it is that has been just tweeted. But nonetheless, you go on TV and you have to do the best you can to make sense of it. And so I tell you this only to say this, that if you have the fortune or misfortune to see me on TV and you see my eyes going in different directions, it means that I have no idea what is going to be asked of me. I've had no preparation, and I am going to try to figure out what covfefe means along with you in terms of my legal analysis. So before something happens, I've turned off my phone. If there's a tweet or a Schiff's memo gets released, we're not covering it tonight. My preparation stopped 15 minutes ago. What we are going to talk about tonight, as best we can in the time we have, is some of the major themes in the Mueller investigation: collusion, obstruction of justice, will the president testify, what is the Steele memorandum, and what's up with the Nunes and Schiff battling memo stuff. If we have time for that, if we don't, ask a question, we'll cover it in the Q&A. And I thought that those major threads, obstruction and collusion and testimony, are that which dominate really what we're seeing most in the Mueller investigation. There are other work streams that we hear about, money laundering and other financial crimes, but we haven't, because Mueller doesn't leak, we don't have much to go on about those work streams. We hear they're out there, but there's not much to talk about. We know with respect to money laundering that Mueller is interested in it because he indicted Paul Manafort and Rick Gates for it, for activities that really are not closely tethered to the campaign. And so one wonders whether that same view of money laundering being relevant to Mueller will arise in the context of Trump and his financial dealings prior to the time that he became president. But we don't have any information about that. No witnesses have come forward and said, yes, Mueller has asked me about that. It's speculative, and so I think best left for Q&A if you want to, but for another day. I'll come back in the spring. So I thought, because we're a diverse group and some have studied law and some smartly haven't, we would first cover some of the who, what, when, whys, and hows of the investigation so we could level set among ourselves. So who is the first question, and that pertains to Robert Mueller. Who is he, and how did he come to be here? So Bob Mueller is probably the most experienced federal prosecutor, federal law enforcement official in the United States. He, as Jennifer said, when I worked for him in the Justice Department, he was the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division, which is the chief law enforcement criminal prosecutor in the United States. He was the United States Attorney in 2 different states. He was FBI Director for 12 years. He has been appointed by Republicans and Democrats across his career, though himself a registered Republican, but that will make no difference whatsoever in his analysis of the facts. So Mueller is the man who's been appointed, and properly so, I think, because Bob Mueller is the person who has the conviction to find a person not responsible if there's no criminal acts that have taken place in his investigative mandate. I can tell you that prosecutors sometimes feel a certain pressure to indict. It's almost empowering or in some way validating of them. It's much harder not to indict. And Mueller has the, I think, character to not indict, which is very good for the president if he's done nothing wrong. On the other hand, Mueller will leave no stone unturned, and if you've done something wrong, he will find it, and if he found it to be material to what he's investigating, he will charge you with that bad behavior. When? So who is Mueller? When do we get Mueller? Well, we know Comey gets fired, FBI Director Comey gets fired on May the 9th. There's some back and forth between the president and Comey and the Justice Department, and that leads to the appointment of Mueller on May the 17th. So when you think about this investigation, you have to realize that Mueller has only been operational since May the 17th. When I was an independent counsel, it took us about 6 weeks to get office space, to get our FBI agents assigned to us, to get our security clearances, in order to get what is called a SCIF, which is a secure facility to look at classified documents. So operationally, he's been around since probably end of June, middle of June. And since that time, he's indicted 2, and he's gotten 2 pleas. So he's moving at a very fast pace as far as prosecutors go in this investigation. So when you hear a lot of conversation on the television about, well, it's been going on for all this time and we have no results. Well, of course, we have 2 indictments and 2 guilty pleas, but he's operationally been at it for a very short time by prosecution standards. Why was he appointed? He was appointed because under the Department of Justice rules, the Justice Department cannot investigate the President of the United States. The President of the United States is the boss. He's the chief executive officer of the executive department, and the Justice Department falls within that. And so there are special rules that are established. When I was appointed, there was a statute called the Independent Counsel Statute, and a 3-judge panel appointed independent counsels. That statute went away after Ken Starr's time in office, and there's new executive regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations that govern the behavior of the special counsel, and those regulations provide that when there is a case where the Justice Department, for conflict or appearance of conflict reasons, cannot investigate the target of the investigation or the subject of the investigation, then the Attorney General is empowered to appoint a special counsel who sits essentially outside of the main hierarchy of the DOJ, and that person fulfills the role that the DOJ would have fulfilled, but for the conflict. And in this case, Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, made that appointment because Attorney General Sessions himself is conflicted out of working on this investigation because under DOJ policy, he had to be recused, notwithstanding requests by the president not to have that happen. DOJ rules were quite clear that you cannot work on an investigation, you cannot be the overseer if you were part of the campaign. And so he was part of the campaign, and the DOJ regs provide that he can't be a part of this, and so he properly recused himself, good for Jeff Sessions, and so we get Mueller instead. So the who, why of this, and what is next. And so Rod Rosenstein appoints Mueller, and he has to tell Mueller what to do. So he writes this letter, which you can't read, but it looks very pretty. He writes this letter to Mueller, and he says, Mueller, this is what you can do. It's called a mandate. This is what Mueller is allowed to do in the place of the Justice Department. And so he has a four-part mandate, essentially. One is to carry on the counterintelligence investigation of alleged Russian interference in the 2016 election. So that investigation, did the Russians interfere in our election? If so, how? Had been started by the FBI. Comey testified to it in March that was ongoing. Mueller picks that up. So that's a work in progress that he assumes responsibility of. The second one is links and coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the Trump campaign. This is the so-called collusion element, and we'll talk about that in a moment, because there is no such thing as collusion in criminal law. In antitrust law, yes, and if you're Colin Kaepernick, probably. But in criminal law, it's more conspiracy and coordination. But this element, number two here, is links and coordination between the Trump campaign and Russians. Number three is the great unknown, and it's all matters that may have arisen or may arise out of the Russian interference investigations. That is, Mueller is empowered by Rosenstein as he comes across evidence that they didn't know might be discovered that leads to criminal or potential criminal activity. Mueller is free to inquire of that. The typical process, and Rosenstein testified that this is what in fact is going on, the typical process is when Mueller comes across something which is not directly in the four corners of the mandate, he goes to Rosenstein and he says, what do you want me to do about this? So you take Manafort case, for example. As I said, not closely tethered to the election and the collusion, but criminal, according to Mueller, money laundering and failure to register as a foreign agent and report foreign bank accounts. And he goes to Rosenstein and says, what do you want me to do with this? What's up with this? You know, I see this stuff, it's probably criminal. Do you want me to give it back to you? You guys want to handle it, or you want me to take care of it? And Rosenstein makes a decision sort of event by event. And in Manafort's case, we believe that what Rosenstein said is, it's all yours, Bob, and Manafort and Gates are under indictment. And then the last part of this is obstruction of justice, and any activity of anyone in the course of Mueller's investigation that he comes across that may be trying to interfere with his investigation. So he has this investigation, he's got this mandate, and he has the right to investigate it, and if anyone endeavors to interfere with it, he has the right to investigate that level of interference. So that's the four parts of his mandate. The how of this, we got who, what, when, who, what, whatever. We've got a couple of those who, whats, and whens. One of them I know is not there. Where? There's no where. Washington, D.C. Is how, and the how is complicated because these are hard cases to make for prosecutors. They're not straightforward, and the bloody knife was left on the floor type of direct evidence cases. They're largely circumstantial, and there is a need for acquisition of evidence through lots of different ways. And we've seen Mueller make good use of his grand jury and his powers as a prosecutor. He has entered into searches and seizures. He has knocked down people's doors. He has grabbed people and brought them into the grand jury. He has obtained a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant against Carter Page under the probable cause belief that Carter Page was acting as a foreign agent of an agent of a foreign power criminally. He's obtained cooperation agreements and a whole host of testimony. So Mueller is using the full array of prosecutorial tools within his prosecutorial basket of rights, and I think that you'll find, as I said about Mueller, that there is no stone that will be left unturned. And when you see the devices that he's using, no-knock warrants to go into Paul Manafort's apartment with warrants to seize all of his computers, all of his cell phones, any bit of electronic data that he has in addition to paper. When he subpoenas his lawyers and he subpoenas his press people, this is a no-nonsense prosecution that is going to look at everything and use all tools. So who, what, when, and how is what's going on before us. It's a lot of hard work. Mueller's moving as fast as he can. I think he'd like this thing to be over as soon as possible. He had a wonderful job at a wonderful law firm in Washington, D.C., where he was finally earning a living. I think he wants to go back there. So I think that those who say he has to hurry it up have to appreciate how fast this investigation is moving and in how many directions it's moving at the same time. So one more preliminary matter. It arises a lot in the course of television commentary and in the newspaper and elsewhere about whether or not Bob Mueller can be fired. You hear all the time whether or not the president is going to fire Mueller. And it's a refrain that will be repeated as evidence gets closer and closer to people, if it gets closer and closer to people. The reality is it's very hard to fire Bob Mueller. Not simply as a matter of another Saturday night massacre like we saw in Watergate, where the president asked the Attorney General to fire the Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, and the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, resigned rather than do that. Then they asked the Deputy Attorney General to fire Archibald Cox because Cox was getting too close to the president for his own comfort. And Kleindienst, the Deputy Attorney General, resigned. And then finally, Solicitor General Bork fired Archibald Cox, which had grave implications for the president and for Bork, actually personally, but it led to the appointment of another special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, who in turn led to the impeachment process against Richard Nixon, or the resignation in light of impeachment. So in political terms, it's very hard to get rid of Mueller because were you to get rid of Mueller, there's just going to be son of Mueller. It's not like the investigation is going to go away. You're just going to get a different prosecutor with a different name that may be as complicated to pronounce, because Mueller is spelled M-U-E, and so you want to say Mueller, and people get it wrong all the time. But he's not easily fired for political reasons. For legal reasons as well. Under the regulations that govern him, 28 CFR section 600.4, it says that only Rod Rosenstein can fire the special counsel. The president cannot directly fire the special counsel. Only Rod Rosenstein can. And Rod Rosenstein can do so only for, and I'll read it to you, misconduct, dereliction of duty, incapacity, conflict of interest, or other good cause. So essentially, Rod Rosenstein can, and he has to give the reason for the firing in writing. So Rosenstein, were he ordered to fire Mueller, has to put in writing what the basis for good cause finding for the firing of Mueller, and Mueller has given us no good cause basis to fire him. We saw in the newspaper a week or two ago that the president had ordered his White House counsel, Don McGahn, to tell Rosenstein that the president wanted Mueller fired. McGahn said he'd quit rather than give that order. Rosenstein testified there is no good cause and I would quit rather than give that order, which would have left the case up to Rachel Brand, who was the Associate Attorney General, who announced last week that she's leaving the Department of Justice because she wants nothing to do with this case, should it fall to her. She's going to become the General Counsel of Walmart, which is a great job, except you got to move to Bentonville, Arkansas. But she didn't want anything to do with firing Mueller, and so she's gone. And so likelihood is that there'll be talk of firing of Mueller, and just like we saw with Ken Starr in the Whitewater investigation, there'll be efforts to make Mueller appear to be partisan so that his findings will be subject to doubt among political believers. But the reality is that in legal terms, it's very hard to get rid of him. And in political terms, the consequences, I think, for the president are dire. I try not to offer political points of view, but in this question of what happens if you fire a special prosecutor, history is just so replete with examples of what the problem is that you can't ignore the practical reality as what that would mean if the president endeavored to do it. So that's who, what, when, where, why, and Mueller's here, in my estimation, pretty much to stay. I should say, as a matter of prediction, I was on TV long, long ago, and we were waiting for the verdict in the O.J. Simpson case, and Greta Van Susteren, the host of the show, was asking us panelists who were waiting for the verdict to come in, what did we predict would happen? And I smartly predicted that he would probably be convicted of second-degree murder because I thought the evidence was just so overwhelming, but that the jury would disqualify some of it and not convict him of first-degree murder. There's the brilliance of my predictive powers. So you take with a grain of salt. When the speech ends and she tells us that it's just been announced that Mueller's been fired, you can see that you've completely wasted your time being here. Tonight, save for the sparkling water, I suppose, and carrots, which is always worth coming out for. So I said that we talk about a couple of things that are of substance, the first one of which is collusion, which I promised you is not actually a crime, save for antitrust law and for poor Colin Kaepernick, who I think the Oakland A's may bring back to camp this year. The Oakland Raiders may bring to camp this year. In the area that we're talking about, collusion really is a couple of things. In the area of campaign finance, it's called coordination. In the area of criminal law, it's called conspiracy. And so in terms of what is improper coordination, the law is pretty clear on this. There's a statute, 52 U.S. Code, section 121. And I should say for the law students in the room, there will be an exam on some of these statutes, and so you should take copious notes. And 50% of their final exam? Yeah, 50% of your final exam. So I'll say that one again, 52 U.S. Code 121. It makes it illegal to receive or solicit a contribution from a foreign national. And the way that statute lays out is that a foreign national cannot give nor be solicited to give a thing of value to a campaign. It doesn't have to be a cash or check or money order type of contribution. It has to be a thing of value. And anyone who solicits it, receives it, attempts to receive it, tries to receive it but doesn't receive it, all of which implicate this statute. And you can conspire to violate this statute. And we'll see how that plays out in a few minutes when we get to this next slide. And so I'll give you an example of a recent case by the Federal Elections Commission. Was a Canadian firm wants to give polling data for free to a U.S. candidate, and the candidate writes properly to the FEC and says, "Can I receive this?" And they write back and say, "No, it's a Canadian, it's polling data, that has value. This statute says anyone who endeavors to receive something of value from a foreign national cannot do so under U.S. law." And so they didn't receive the polling data. When we get to the June 9th meeting and Donald Trump Jr., you'll wonder, why didn't they do the same? But it's a different proposition. So collusion in respect of election law is coordination. Conspiracy is as it relates to criminal law. There is a statute, write it down, you law students, 18 U.S. Code 1030, which makes it a crime under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I always want to say consumer, but it's Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It makes it a crime to intentionally access a computer of another without authorization. It makes it a crime it is a crime to conspire to do that. It is a crime to receive that data and further distribute it. The stolen property statutes may apply, but again, there's a legal question about under the stolen property statute, it has to be property and a thing of value, and it's not clear by the case law whether or not data information is property under the receiving stolen property statute. Good law review article for those of you who are in the second year of school and want to write a law review article. But we know that in the law, that hacking into someone's computer is a crime, conspiring with those hackers to distribute it, receiving it, and further distributing it is all a crime. And we'll talk about how that relates after we get through with this set of slides in what's known as the Wikileaks communications between Don Jr. and the campaign. And finally, I wanted to mention, it's not technically collusion, but it sort of fits within the mandate, I think, that Mueller will be looking at, which is this failure to register as a foreign agent. In the law of the United States, if you represent a foreign government, you have to register with the Attorney General and say, I am an agent on behalf of this foreign government, and I will be working on their behalf, and as long as they're not a sanctioned government like Iran or North Korea that you cannot work on behalf of, if they are a country that is not under sanctions, you register with the Attorney General, and once your registration is duly noted and approved, you can act on behalf of that. You can write op-eds, you can take out lobbying, take on lobbying efforts, whatever you want. Failure to register is a crime. It's a 5-year felony to failure to register as a foreign agent and not advise the Attorney General that you're doing that. And we saw in the Manafort-Gates indictments that that's exactly what they were charged with as well. They were charged with failing to register as foreign agents for the government of Ukraine and the Ukraine political party, a state party, which is also covered by the statute. And they were charged with that crime and a conspiracy to violate that statute. So again, I bring it in here because there is this conspiracy to avoid the registration of a foreign agent as a foreign agent. And this is relevant in the case of Carter Page, who we saw in the newspaper had a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act surveillance warrant issued against him for his activities as a foreign agent on behalf of Russia when he failed to register for it. And there are conspiracy charges that can be brought against this. We'll talk about it maybe in the question and answer, Jennifer, with what's called a conspiracy to defraud the United States, Section 371 of the United States Code. And that also is implicated by the failure to register as a foreign agent stuff. And is that under mandate by Mueller and Rosenstein? So I'm hoping this is not too legalistic to start, but it's important to understand what is it that Mueller is looking at? What crimes is it that are under inquiry by him? And then let's look at the facts and see how those facts relate to these crimes. So we know there's federal elections crimes, we know there's computer hacking crimes, and now we know that it's a failure to register as a foreign agent crime. 3 basic crimes. And so you say, well, that's great. What does that have to do with Trump? And I'm glad you asked. So the Trump Tower meeting. So this is important stuff from the standpoint of, did the White House, not the White House, did the Trump campaign in any way undertake activity that violates any of these statutes? And the principal statute that we're talking about at the moment in the Trump Tower meeting, though it could have some obstruction of justice aspects to it, but the principal thing that we're talking about in this case is this coordination collusion inquiry. It all starts on June the 3rd, when Don Jr. receives an email from the Agalarov family, a billionaire family in Russia, and the emails that come to Don Jr. say, and the Trumps knew the Agalarovs through the Miss Universe pageant that they held in 2013. The email that comes to Don Jr., which we got to see these emails later on, the email says, the Crown Prosecutor of Russia met with the Agalarovs this morning, and in their meeting offered to provide the Trump campaign with some official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary Clinton and her dealings with Russia and would be very useful to your father. This is obviously a very high level and sensitive information, but is part of the Russia and its government's effort to support Mr. Trump. That's the email that Don Jr. gets. Now you'd think when we talked about the Canadian firm that's trying to figure out whether it can give polling data. Now here's the Russian government saying that we have information to provide to you that may be acquired by theft or is clearly something of value, opposition research, that Don Jr. would have said, you know, we should talk to the Federal Election Commission and see whether we can receive this. No, that's not exactly what Don Jr.'s response was. Indeed, his Jr.'s response was, quote, if that's what you say, I love it, especially later in the summer, because it's harder to respond to the closer you get to the election date. So on June the 3rd, we get this Don Jr. receives this inquiry from Russia saying, we've got information that can help your father, and we'd like to meet with you. And Don Jr. says, I love it, let's just meet a little bit later in the summer. They have emails back and forth, and they ultimately do meet on June the 9th. But the thing that's of interest is this, what happens on June the 7th? On June the 3rd, they get this email, and it says, we got stuff for you. On June the 7th, the president says, stand by, America. I have an important announcement that's going to be coming up in a few days. I'm going to be making a speech, and it's going to have a lot of information that will be very important. And he says, quote, I'm going to give a major speech probably on Monday. It's a few days after the June 9th. Of next week, and we're going to be discussing all the things that have taken place with the Clintons. I think you're going to find it very, very interesting and very informative. So it leads one to conclude that Don Jr. gets an email on June the 3rd. He says, Dad, here's stuff that's coming in, and we're going to get the dirt on Hillary. The father announces to the world, stand by, big announcements coming, and so we wait, and then the June 9th meeting occurs, and it's a bit of a bust, which is to say that they did not get the dirt that they were hoping for based on the June 3rd email, and though 8 Russians, we learn ultimately, attended that meeting with Don Jr. and Paul Manafort and Jared Kushner, so the 3 top people of the campaign, Manafort, the campaign chair, Jared Kushner, the wunderkind, and Don Jr., the kid striving for his father's love, all meet there at Trump Tower with 8 Russians, and they just don't get the dirt. And so what happens? The president-elect, the president-to-be, never gives the speech. And it gives one pause when you'll see the timeline later on when the president is saying, I didn't know anything about this meeting. And you think, well, really? How is it that you're going to give a speech and make an announcement of it just a few days before the meeting, and then when the meeting is a bust, you don't give the speech? So it's too sort of coincidental for too many people. But that's that timeline. The other thing, though, that's interesting is that right at the same time, right after this meeting where they are saying to Don Jr., we have stuff, and we're going to get stuff for you on Clinton that is going to be helpful to your campaign. That, remember, I read you that email on June the 3rd. We have stuff we want. This is part of the Russian effort to help the campaign. The DNC hack occurs. Right after that meeting comes the hack of the DNC computers, where we'll see what happens with that information. But the DNC gets hacked. The Clinton campaign complains bitterly on television that this is an effort by the Russian government to undermine her campaign. Don Jr. Comes on CNN and he says, quote, to Jake Tapper, Clinton's comments that the Russians may have been behind this hack are, quote, disgusting and so phony. He said to the Clinton campaign, they will lie and do anything to win. Now, he says this right after, of course, he's just had the meeting on the June 9th where they are promising dirt on Clinton. What does the president do after all of this? He says, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you can find the Clinton missing emails. So again, it creates in the minds of prosecutors the potential for actors conspiring with one another, coordinating with foreign nationals to receive information that is stolen from computers and which is a thing of value as a matter of election law. So when you talk about, is there a collusion investigation going on? You'll know, one, there's no such thing as collusion except if you're Colin Kaepernick or an antitrust violator. But two, it is the Federal Elections Commission's and it is the criminal law. And there's a whole lot of stuff here that begins to look curiouser and curiouser, as the expression goes. Now, throughout July, what happens is that multiple people are doing multiple things. George Papadopoulos is going to Russia and meeting with Russians. Carter Page is going to Russia and meeting with Russians. Attorney General Sessions, or Attorney General 2B, Senator Sessions, is meeting with Russian Ambassador Kislyak at the Republican National Convention. And so there's a whole host of stuff that's going on that gives one wonder whether or not this is part of this, I'll keep calling it collusive, but collusive activity between the campaign and the Russians. And we don't see any quid pro quo really as it relates to these people until we get to the Republican National Convention, when the plank on the Ukraine, which is important to Russia because of Russia's invasion of Crimea and its annexation and the turnover in government by Russia, there's a lot of talk about there should be sanctions to sanction that sort of behavior. Instead, what happens, Manafort, we think, leading the charge, changes the plank in the Republican National Convention documentation to soften the view that the Republican platform will take on Russia, on Ukraine and Ukraine sanctions. So we have this point in time where we've had these initial meetings and we've had indications of contact and coordination between them. What is the Trump campaign, though, saying about this? You start in this November to December period, and you see time in and time out the campaign hierarchy saying no such meetings took place. So there's a flat-out denial of the meetings. Hope Hicks says it never happens. Kellyanne Conway says absolutely not, and I just talked about this with the president. When Trump Jr. is interviewed about it, he said, and I quote, "I may have met with some Russians in my life, but none that I can think of at the moment, and certainly none when I was representing the campaign in any way, shape, or form." So there's this public denial campaign that's taking place in the winter months. It's not a crime to lie to the American people. Sin, maybe, but not a crime. Except Ken Starr recently said on television that he thought that it was a crime and that it should be looked at by Bob Mueller. I don't know what criminal code provision he was talking about, but we see in this November period this big time effort to deny that this meeting on June the 9th and everything that took place in between actually occurred, until we get to the July of 2017. In July of 2017, and I won't go through all of these slides, but in essence, what happens in July of 2017 is that the New York Times receives a copy of all of the emails between Don Jr. and the Agalarovs, that one that we started on June the 3rd. And they tell Don Jr., we're going to publish it. And we're going to publish in the New York Times all of the emails where you say, I love it, and he says we've got dirt, and the Russians are trying to help the campaign. And Don Jr. is desperate now. He's got to make a statement because he has said there has been no meeting, and I don't know what you're talking about, and it's a damnable lie, and those Clintons will do anything to win an election. What he does is he writes a statement, or we think he writes a statement, which basically says, it was a short, I can read it to you. He says, it was a short introductory meeting. I asked Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort to stop by. We preliminarily discussed a program about Russian adoption. It was, which was active in America a few years ago. Nothing about the campaign came up. There was no follow-up, and that was the end of the meeting. So he says in July, what the New York Times is saying is untrue, until the New York Times, of course, publishes the actual emails, and then he's got to issue a second clarifying statement. Says, well, maybe I didn't give you all of the information that I should have given you. But what becomes most important is that the White House says on July the 10th that it knew nothing about this meeting. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders says that the president didn't know anything about this, and and she says, quote, "I believe he learned about it just in the last few days." So this is July July 10th of 2017, where the president is saying that he didn't know anything about it, and they say, again, that the president had nothing to do with any of the statements that Don Jr. has made. Don Jr. is on his own, they said, when issuing the first statement that this was about Russian adoptions, and the second statement said, well, maybe it was a little bit about something else, but mostly it was about Russian adoptions. Jay Sekulow, Trump's lawyer, goes on the television, and he says, the president was not involved in anything to do with Don Jr.'s statement. He says, July 16th on NBC, Chris Todd, "I want to be clear, the president was not involved in drafting that statement, that initial statement by Don Jr. that I read to you that said, this is all about adoptions." Well, you know, maybe that's so, except the Washington Post then reports that not only was Don Jr. not alone in the writing of this statement, but that his father actually wrote the statement on Air Force One on July 8th when flying home from the G20 summit. And so Don Jr.'s initial statement, that misleading statement, was drafted by the President of the United States on Air Force One and put out purposefully, according to the Washington Post. In response to it, the president says, Sarah Sanders says, well, the president may have weighed in as any father might. And that's the end of the saga of the June 9th meeting. So that saga implicates a whole host of things: coordination, conspiracy, and potentially obstruction of justice. And Mueller has that in his sights, and you'll hear all the time about the June 9th meeting, and why is it important? Because it just seemed to be a one-off meeting. Why it's important is what we've just gone through. It implicates lying to the public. Ken Starr says it's a crime. Who am I to doubt him? He was a federal judge. It involves coordination in violation of that federal election statute. It involves violations potentially and conspiracy to violate the Computer Form and Abuse Act, and it potentially is obstructive behavior on behalf of Donald Trump by endeavoring to have people make false statements on his behalf. The next thing, when do I stop talking?
I'm enjoying this so much, so I wasn't going to have you stop, but I'm thinking maybe 15 minutes, and then we can start.
Okay, then we can ask questions. All right, so I'll try to be coherent. WikiLeaks, that's the next thing that falls into this collusion bucket. WikiLeaks, for those of you who don't know anything about WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks was formed by a fellow named Julian Assange. You know, it's like one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. It depends on what your political perspective is on who Julian Assange is. But Julian Assange, who's living under political asylum in the Embassy of Ecuador in London at the moment, forms the organization WikiLeaks, and it is an organization that is disseminating information a la Snowden and others about what they consider to be improprieties in governments around the world. And some of the stuff is quite interesting. They consider themselves a news organization and with First Amendment rights. Others consider them, like the United States government, considers them to be a non-state national intelligence service coordinating with Russia. So the U.S. intelligence organizations looks at WikiLeaks and says that they are essentially an agent of a foreign government, Russia, and that they're acting as a non-state intelligence service, meaning essentially they're equivalent to the FBI and the CIA and MI6 and other state-acting intelligence agencies. So that's the government's view of them is what is operative in respect of understanding whether or not Don Jr.'s activity with respect to WikiLeaks and Roger Stone's activities with respect to WikiLeaks implicates criminal behavior. So what happens? Poor Don Jr., he gets a lot of emails, He gets an initial email on September 16th from WikiLeaks saying that there's going to be an anti-Trump website that's coming up, and that he, Don Jr., might want to take precautions against it. On October 3rd, to move forward with some more haste than I am capable of doing mostly, he gets another heads up from WikiLeaks saying that on the campaign trail, Hillary Clinton said that they should drone Julian Assange. That was upsetting to Julian Assange, and he wanted WikiLeaks wanted Don Jr. to start pushing that story, which, again, Don Jr. should have thought, well, I wonder, this is a non-state government intelligence agency asking me to put forth information on their behalf. Maybe I ought to talk to law enforcement about that and see whether that's okay for me to do. Not Don Jr. He pushes out the story about the drone Julian Assange quote, and he writes back to WikiLeaks saying, I did it, Good for you, Don Jr. You may have just violated a whole host of national intelligence protocols and criminal laws. WikiLeaks then obtains the hacked Podesta and DNC emails. Remember we talked about a little bit before how the DNC emails get hacked back in June, and no one knows, other than that they've been hacked, what's up with them, except until WikiLeaks gets them, and then WikiLeaks starts publishing all of this. Again, and people say, well, is this part of the campaign that the Agrilarovs promised on June 3rd would be coming forth from the Russian Crown Prosecutor, no less, to dirty up the Clinton campaign? WikiLeaks, U.S. government says, is a non-state actor on behalf of the Russian government, obtains these stolen emails and starts pushing them out into the public. Interestingly, WikiLeaks, coincidence or not, you figure it out for yourself, WikiLeaks first releases the first group of Podesta, John Podesta, who's the chairman of the Hillary Clinton campaign, starts pushing out the Podesta emails right after the Access Hollywood tapes are revealed. So Access Hollywood comes out, Donald Trump is saying what he says about his activities with women. The Me Too movement doesn't affect him, it seems. And that story is not good for Donald Trump, not fatal as it turns out. But what happens, what does WikiLeaks do? They try to create a counter narrative, some will say, by pushing out the Podesta emails at the exact same time. So they put out these Podesta emails. What does the president do? He says on the campaign trail, I love WikiLeaks, a non-state intelligence service actor, according to our U.S. intelligence service. He says, I love WikiLeaks in the aftermath of WikiLeaks releasing into the public domain stolen emails. Maybe you think, well, that's not good, and maybe that's enough, and that's the end of the story. We can move on to the rest of this speech, but not so. Not with Don Jr. WikiLeaks sends to Don Jr. in the aftermath of Donald Trump saying, I love WikiLeaks, and the release of the Podesta emails into the public domain, WikiLeaks sends to Don Jr. a link that says, if you push this link forward out into the public domain, people will be able to search the Podesta emails more easily. So what he essentially is saying to WikiLeaks is saying to him, look, we've pushed out all these emails. They're not getting a lot of traction because they're hard to search. Here's a link that'll let people search it more easily to find all that which is damaging within the WikiLeaks with greater facility. And they give that to Don Jr. 15 minutes after that 15 minutes after that link is received by Don Jr., the president-to-be, Donald Trump, tweets, "Very little pickup by the dishonest media of the incredible information provided by WikiLeaks." So Don Jr. says, "Hey, Dad, we're not getting enough coverage on this WikiLeaks stuff, which is really bad for the Podesta, DNC, Clinton campaign." The president tweets out, "Hey, America, dishonest media is not covering this. You ought to look at it." And Don Jr. is putting out the link to let them search it more easily. And he tweaks out the link. WikiLeaks says, we're a little bit nervous. We're a little bit nervous that people are going to think that we're trying to help you too much here, and that they're going to, sort of see the conspiracy between us. They say, "Why don't you," I don't think it's on this slide. It says, "Why don't you give us a small sample of the president-elect's," I keep saying the president because he's the president, "why don't you send us a small sample of your father's tax returns, which we'll then put out, which will show everybody that we're really not just on your side, but we're on Hillary Clinton's side because we published the tax returns." That Don Jr. does not decide to do. So to make a longer story shorter, that relationship, that Don Jr. WikiLeaks relationship, where WikiLeaks, we know for certain, has stolen information. We think the Russian intelligence services were those who acquired that information. That's what our intelligence agencies tell us. Donald Jr. making no inquiry of FBI or National Intelligence Services when he gets an inquiry saying, "We've got stolen information. What do you want to do with it?" Doesn't go to the law enforcement authorities and say, "What should we do with it?" Instead, he says, "Wow, and I'll disseminate it," and he disseminates it. So if you're Mueller, you think, maybe there is a crime here. Maybe there is a conspiracy to, remember we talked about this Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and it's a crime to receive and distribute that information. May not be stolen property, we're not sure. We're waiting for one of you to write a law review article on it. Maybe it's a crime to do just that. And Don Jr. is, in the eye of the bullseye around WikiLeaks and the June 9th meeting. And again, all this stuff is going on at the same time that Papadopoulos is traveling to Russia and Carter Page is traveling to Russia, and, which we can't talk about today because we don't have time for sure, and I don't know that I completely understand it, so I purposely left it toward the end here so I wouldn't have to talk about it, is the Facebook, Twitter, social media campaign that the Russians are running at the same time. And whether there was coordination between that effort and the Cambridge Analytica, Jared Kushner data targeting information campaign. Remember, the theory is the Russians have acquired a whole host of information through their Facebook and Twitter messaging, I guess, about districts where the president may have a message that you wouldn't think is going to resonate. And that information, they say, is given to the theory. It's a theory, it's speculation, it's not a fact. That message was given to the Jared Kushner, who's running the Trump data analytics campaign, that they have an agreement between two analytics organizations to target these specific districts in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and states that Trump surprisingly won by accumulation of 75,000 votes. So remember, Trump loses by 3 million votes in the popular election. He wins the Electoral College by a swing of 75,000 votes. That was the total difference in the few states that made up the majority for the president. And those are states that were not expected to go the Trump way, and some say, and the reason they did may lie in the Russian Facebook, Twitter, Cambridge Analytica, which is run by Bannon, and Jared Kushner data analytics. But again, that's just a theory, and we don't know whether or not there's truth to it. But that's the collusion.
So I'm gonna.
Stuff. So the stuff that we should talk about in the question and answer period is obstruction of justice and abuse of power. And then we'll let you ask any questions that you want that don't involve math. Okay. Do you want me to stand or sit?
Do we have a mic here or do I have to stand? Emily, do I have a mic here or do I have to go up? Mic? Okay. So thank you so much, Michael. And before you encourage students here to write a law journal article on the topic of a thing of value, I'm actually working on one. So instead, encourage them to work with me on that topic. It's very interesting. I'm looking at what those words mean for purposes of 52 USC 30121,
Yeah.
but also across other statutes, and it's been pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
It used to be Rolexes, and that's it.
But yeah, you're right. There's another advisory opinion, I think, from the FEC where about data and whether someone could actually volunteer for a campaign if he had polling data in his mind, right? But that was fine as long as he didn't share the information that he had. This was someone who was not a foreign national,
Right.
but it was trying to find a value. So the point is for people to say that information or opposition research is too intangible to be something of value. I don't think that the history supports it, but I think it's an interesting question.
And you should look at sanctions law, because in sanctions law, it's illegal to do business with a country or person that's under sanction. And one of the questions that arises, what about your intellectual, knowledge? Is that, if you share that, your know-how, is that a sanctions violation? And there's a lot of discussion about that.
It turns out it's very interesting, but what I want to, getting back to this, one thing, I know I'm going to open this up to questions, and Michael wants us to focus on obstruction, but I'm going to ask something else, which is, there seems to be a statement or a thought that people have, which is, well, so what, right? The so what question that arises from, if we can't prove that any of this impacted the outcome of the election, why do we care if, this campaign, the Trump campaign, may have had assistance or actually participated in the, breaking into the Democratic National Committee emails? And sometimes it's immediate for anyone who was around during Watergate to say, well, Nixon won by a tremendous landslide, both in terms of the electoral vote and the popular vote in 1972. And no one asked the question, well, I used to say, no one made that statement during the Nixon era. We still pursued the Watergate investigation and near impeachment, and there was there were convictions of folks. But then I came to find out, listening to this great podcast called Slow Burn, that in fact, that during the Nixon era, during the Watergate era, it wasn't suddenly Washington Post breaks a story and then boom, everybody gets behind this investigation. In fact, it wasn't just Nixon who tried to obstruct justice, but it turns out that the public was very skeptical about the Watergate investigation, and it sort of took a while for the public to turn. So I wanted to ask you,
and I'll just say one thing about that, which you're absolutely right about. And if you look back into the 1970s in the articles, in the early part of this, what does Nixon say about this over and over and over? Witch hunt. Those are his words over and over. This is a witch hunt. So I guess if you're under investigation by an independent counsel, witch hunt is the mantra.
It works for a while, I suppose. And so I guess that gets us to the point here, which is I really appreciate your being here, because none of us has a crystal ball. We don't know. We're sitting here in a really kind of exciting, confusing, difficult time when we're facing something that is, a special prosecutor investigating the President of the United States, and we don't know, and his campaign, and we have no idea where this is going. So I really appreciate your trying to manage this information in a very precise legal way and say, what are the facts that we know? Where do we think it'll lead? So what I want to say to you, though, I'm going to push you a little farther and say, if you were Robert Mueller, and you've worked for him before, you were on his dream team, what do you think are the most promising, based on the facts that we know so far, either through the existing indictments or the pleas, or what you trust from the news sources, which do you think are the most promising criminal cases? And I know I'm keeping in mind that you were wrong about OJ, so I'm feeling bad asking you this. But what do you think the most promising leads are, and what would you be the most excited to pursue?
So I want to say that I don't know is the honest answer. But what we've talked about for the last 40-ish minutes is, and the reason we spent this amount of time on it, so you understand sort of the nuance of that which just occurred between Donald Trump Jr. and WikiLeaks, and Donald Trump Jr. and the Russians, and the father's involvement and denials, is that I think that there is rich territory for a federal prosecutor to look at this coordination, conspiracy, we'll call it collusion for our discussion purposes, collusion area. I think that that is something that if I were Mueller, I'd spend time with. I don't know necessarily that the president is a target of that, but his son may well be. You know, so when you think about the investigation, you think not in some monolith that this is going to be the Trump campaign indicted. You don't, in Trump, unless it's a RICO organization, you don't indict the organization. You indict individuals for their individually responsible acts. So whether or not this implicates Donald Trump, now the president, is not as clear to me as whether or not his son and Roger Stone and Carter Page are in jeopardy with respect to this collusion, coordination, conspiracy stuff. And then the other thing that I think has to be looked at if you're a special prosecutor with great interest is this question of obstruction of justice and all of the various acts that the president has undertaken since he arrived in the White House, starting with the firing of Jim Comey, or perhaps even a little bit before the firing of Jim Comey, with the requests for loyalty by Jim Comey, with the requests by the president to have Jim Comey let the Flynn investigation go. Remember, Flynn is the head of the National Intelligence outfit in the White House, and he's under investigation by a U.S. Attorney's Office in Virginia as to whether or not he has acted improperly. And the president says to Comey, "Can you let that go?" Which is interfering with an ongoing prosecution if the president had the state of mind that's required for that. And there are other acts that the president, we have slides, you can free to distribute them, but he engaged in a lot of acts like the ones we've just talked about, as well as, and I think most problematic for me, is reported that he asked Coates and Rogers and Pompeo, the heads of the various national intelligence services, FBI, DNI, not FBI, CIA, DNI, to ask the FBI to stand down in the investigation. That to me is very problematic. If you remember back to Watergate, what really was the tipping point for Richard Nixon was when he asked the CIA to intervene with the FBI to stop investigating him. That, by the prosecutor's standpoint, was sort of textbook interference, obstruction of justice. And I think the president may have, if it turns out that the evidence supports the allegations, may have done the exact same thing with respect to his national security apparatus. And so I think those are the two areas that I'd look at most closely from the evidence that we have available to us in the public record.
Well, thank you. And I want to invite anyone from the audience to step up. It's important because we're podcasting this, that there are three microphones. And so if you can find one of them and approach it, I will try to, go from microphone to microphone. So again, instead of raising your hand, please get up in line in front of one of the microphones, and then I'll acknowledge you to speak. And also, sorry, one thing is a nice practice, since we all don't know each other, is to say your name and, if you're a student, or what you're, why you're here, or something you want to say, or your favorite Ben & Jerry's flavor, what have you.
I'm Gordon, or is this?
No, wait, Gordon?
Wait, hold on one second. Is that mic working? Can we raise it? Or can
There
you
you
lift
go.
it out of the thing?
Hello? All right. So I'm Gordon Merrick. I'm a student here at 1L, and I just had a, thank you, Bill, question about what happens if he does get impeached. Because if Russia did collude with the campaign, does that just null the election in entirety and there has to be a special election, which that obviously wouldn't happen,
Okay.
but...
Sure. So let's talk about impeachment. Let's go backwards and then forward so people can, so everyone heard the question is what happens if he gets impeached? So we talked a little bit about obstruction of justice and those acts that may rise to the level of obstruction of justice. If you fired Comey impermissibly with corrupt motive, if you ask the law enforcement agencies to intervene with corrupt motive, can you be charged with obstruction of justice? And there's an open debate among constitutional lawyers whether or not a sitting president can be indicted. It's not clear that that is the case. No president has been indicted. Clinton wasn't indicted, Nixon wasn't indicted, Johnson wasn't indicted, the old Johnson, Andrew. Instead, they go to the articles of impeachment. The abuse of power is that which is defined in the Constitution. Federalist 65, Hamilton talked about what is an abuse of power. That's an abuse of one's office in a corrupt manner. And so let's say we found that the president is, by the view of the special prosecutor, one who has engaged in obstructive behavior, but that he doesn't want to take the chance of indicting him because it's unclear whether he can be indicted. So instead he refers the matter to the House of Representatives for consideration for an article of impeachment. Once he does that, he's sort of done. He can indict the president when the president leaves office. You know, he's always free to indict him, but when he's a private citizen, but when he's not, he has this, question mark in his mind. So he says, I'm going to refer this to the House of Representatives. He refers it to the House of Representatives, and he's sort of done. He has to stand down. Then it's within the purview of the House to decide whether they want to bring articles of impeachment, which is really essentially an indictment by the House. It charges the president with behavior which they say is an abuse of power and for which he should be removed from office. And 218 House members, a simple majority of the House, has to vote in favor of those articles of impeachment. If they do, that's what happened to Clinton, the simple majority of the House voted in favor of articles of impeachment, and those articles of impeachment can get referred to the Senate, and then the Senate is the trial body, and the Senate then tries the case. Evidence is presented, lawyers talk in the well of the court. You can go back and look at the arguments in the well in the Senate, and the Senate has to vote, and 2/3 majority of the Senate has to vote to convict, 67 votes, and he's convicted. In Clinton's case, they didn't get 67, so he stayed in office. And so in your hypothetical, he gets articles of impeachment written, the House refers it to the Senate tries the case, and they convict him by 67 votes. He then is removed from office, which then leaves Vice President Pence as in the order of succession as President of the United States. If Pence somehow became subject to the same process, then I forget who's next. I think Majority Leader of the House. I think it's Ryan, I think.
Speaker of the House.
Yeah, Speaker of the House. Why did I say
But
Majority
if
Leader?
the
Speaker of the
Democrats
House.
take the majority,
Right.
then it'd be Nancy Pelosi.
Right. Alexander Haig's in charge here. That's exactly right. So,
Can I wait? I have to. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to say, the answer to your question is, no, the election is not rendered null and void. We just get Vice President Pence as our president, and then assuming that happens before 2020, then you have a vote to see whether you want to retain him as president or not.
Thank you. And I just need to.
Gordon, does that answer the question, or did you look like you have a follow-up on
Gordon, can I just jump in before
Yeah,
you
of
ask your follow-up question? Because as you know, I made no promises about not mentioning breaking news, Michael. I'm so sorry. It's nothing big, but it's nothing small. Apparently, Rick Gates is close to finalizing a plea deal with Robert Mueller. Maybe it's something you suspected. You don't have to comment on that now if you don't want to,
Right,
but I think everyone wants you to. I also want to make sure Gordon gets his question fully
Okay,
answered.
so Gordon, hold that 1 second. So Paul Manafort and Rick Gates are indicted for money laundering, failure to register as a foreign agent, conspiracy to do the same, and failure to report foreign bank accounts. He has a group of lawyers, Gates does, who's representing him. About 2 weeks ago, he gets rid of all of those lawyers and he hires this fellow, Tom Green, a very well-regarded criminal lawyer in Washington, D.C. Tom is known for two things. One is taking a case all the way to trial and fighting to the death, and two, making a very good plea agreement for his client. And all the smart money in Washington was, Green is here to make a deal. And he was in court yesterday in a closed-door session. The media was not allowed in there, where he made his first appearance on behalf of Gates, and the media coming out said a plea deal is in the works. And so the question is, with respect to this plea deal, is he simply pleading guilty, saying, yes, I did this, please treat me more favorably under the sentencing guidelines, or is he saying, yes, I did this, please treat me more favorably under the sentencing guidelines, and I'm going to cooperate with you and testify against Manafort? And because remember, when Manafort was fired from being the campaign manager, Gates stayed on. So for a longer period of time, Gates is integrally related into the Trump campaign and may know where skeletons lie, and that may be of interest to Mueller, if there are skeletons indeed that are lying.
Thank you, and that means when you get done talking tonight, check your email. You might need to find a studio.
And there's none here. It's closest as Burlington. They've already called to see if I want to be on Aaron Burnett. So
Okay, tomorrow.
there you have it. Gordon, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, thanks for that insight. I just am having a hard time trying to figure out how we would get around a constitutional crisis if it's found that a foreign government actively supported a campaign which then caused them to win, and how it would be okay for even a vice presidential candidate who might have had nothing to do with the collusion, how would he have an actual mandate to run the country?
Well, you use, so I answered the first time you asked that question, I answered by saying the Constitution of the United States provides that the vice president will succeed the president if the president is no longer president, whether it's 25th Amendment stuff, capability, or impeachment. It doesn't say anything about that successor having a mandate. So the key word there in your sentence, in your question is, will he have a mandate? It would seem to me hard to understand how the American population would believe that he knew nothing about what was going on here and therefore had a mandate to govern. But a lot of things are of confusion to me about the American voting populace these days. So it's hard to know. But the answer is, depending on when it happens, it's whenever the next presidential election is that the American people get to say whether they feel that the person deserves to stay on or not.
Okay,
Thank
Mike.
you.
Oh, sorry,
You're
thank you. Mike 2?
Hi, my name is Borna, and I'm a law school student here. And I want to ask about another guilty plea that's not been in the news. Michael Flynn pleaded guilty to making false statements to the FBI. And there were some commentators when the news came out, I think last year, that they were surprised that there wasn't much in that report, in the plea agreement.
In the information that he pleaded guilty to.
Correct. And there have been 3 theories flying around as to why that may be so. I was curious about your thoughts on that. One is that they think that Michael Flynn got this really special deal and basically agreed to plead guilty, but he's going to keep this information quiet until trial. That's one theory.
Whose trial?
Oh, until someone's trial. They think that he's got all this information, he's turned on someone, he's cooperating with the investigation, there's a big indictment coming up. That's one theory that I've read. The second one is that there's just nothing there, that this is all they were able to, he was guilty of making false statements to the FBI, and that's what they found, and it was those 2 statements, and that's it. And then the third is that there is something, but there was no deal. They just are waiting to come out with an amended charge against him at a later time, other crimes, that he's agreed to plead guilty to false statements now, but there may be other crimes that he may have conspired to commit and that they are going to bring those later. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Sure, good question. So I think the answer to the question of whether or not Michael Flynn and, by the same token, George Papadopoulos, who also pleaded guilty to a single false statements information, are cooperating or not, and if so, as to what are they cooperating. And I think that the answer along your three-part quiz there is
He studied white-collar crime in the fall, so.
is good. Is the first, which is to say that he is cooperating with Mueller, because we know pretty much from the public record that Michael Flynn was engaged in the type of Foreign Agent Registration Act violations that we talked about. Remember, it's illegal to act as a foreign agent of a foreign government without registering with the Attorney General. And it's pretty clear that Michael Flynn was doing that on behalf of Turkey. The evidence is pretty profound. He's written op-eds and the like for it. So on its face, the FARA charges and conspiracy to violate FARA seem to be pretty straightforward charges for any prosecutor to bring. So even if he didn't collude in the sense that we've been talking about, a coordination and conspiracy, there are additional charges that would have been straightforward blocking and tackling for Robert Mueller to bring. So my thought is that he got a charge of 1,001 lying to federal agents in cooperation, as a result of his agreement to provide substantial cooperation to the federal prosecutor. Whether that's at a trial, we don't know. It could just be that he's providing substantial cooperation of what it was that was going on that he had insight into, or whether it provides a window into understanding certain things. So we talked about obstruction of justice, and we said, well, obstruction of justice is a specific intent crime. You've got to intend to obstruct justice. You know, if you accidentally knocked over a mailbox which had a letter in it, which was, and you know, the Mrs. McGillicuddy the cow kicking the can that creates the Chicago fire, that's not provable as obstruction of justice because you had no intent to do it. What Flynn may have information on is whether or not the president said to Comey in the Oval Office, let the Flynn investigation go. Because that's a key question in this question of did he abuse his office or did he violate statutory obstruction of justice. And it may well be that the president said to Flynn, like he said to Sheriff Arpaio, don't worry, I've got you covered. I just told Comey to drop the investigation. Of course, everyone's going to do what I asked them to do. So it may be that that, again, is not an indictable offense that leads to a trial of the president for that, or even a referral to the House for articles of impeachment. But Mueller may just want that information because he's got to write. Remember, Mueller, at the end of his investigation, has to write a report to the Attorney General explaining all the indictments that he brought and why he declined to indict people. So it may well be that he's gathering information for the purpose of deciding whether criminal laws have been violated and what to do about that, and if not, so he can tell a full story to the Attorney General when he turns off the light at the end of his investigation.
Thank you.
Okay, sure?
Mike 3.
Hi, my name's Sarah Anderson. I'm a third-year law student here.
Oh, there you are, behind the
Yeah.
pole. I was wondering, where are you?
I want to go back to the June 9th meeting and the thing of value. So as far as the American people know, he never received this thing of value. Does that matter, or is it just the fact that he pursued this thing of value?
Good question, and the answer is it probably doesn't matter because the statute says that you actually don't have to get, you have to endeavor to get, you have to solicit to get, you've got to participate in the getting of, but the thing doesn't have to actually be delivered. So if I solicit a foreign national to give me money, that's a violation of the statute, even if I don't get the money itself. Here, they surely got something, people believe. It wasn't just a completely empty bag that was left on the table. What it was, we just don't know, and whether it was the WikiLeaks information, whether it was the hacked information, the promise that there will be forthcoming stuff, we don't know. But I think the majority reading of the statute would say that the mere fact that they didn't get that which they intended to get doesn't deprive the prosecutor of the possibility of bringing a charge under that statute.
Okay, back to Mike 1.
Thank you. Frank Lesher, a retired corporate counsel. Not criminal, no criminal work.
I thought you were talking about your own personal behavior.
Yeah, that too. To say that, my wife is here. Quick question, relative to your first slide about the chart, the Rod Rosenstein charter, the four
Right.
bullets.
Yes,
I think the third one said TBD.
that's the arise out of, might arise or may have arisen.
Right.
Mhm.
We heard Trump quite a while ago say sort of a warning to Mueller to don't go into my private affairs.
Yep.
What if Mueller does find, for example, tax evasion or money laundering through the sales of his, very expensive condos in New York to Russians, which I understand is a common way for people from Russia and other oligarchs with a lot of money to hide. They buy expensive real estate here.
Right.
If he comes across those, would that be something that he could indict for?
Well, so the President of the United States gave an interview with the New York Times in the Oval Office, and they asked him whether or not there was a red line that Mueller, if he engaged in inquiry of, would cross as far as the President is concerned. And they asked him specifically your personal financial dealings, and the President said that would be a red line as far as I'm concerned. Of course, two things are obvious. The President doesn't get to tell the prosecutor what is a red line and what isn't a red line. If I'm under investigation for something by a prosecutor, I can't say, all right, prosecutor, you can't investigate me for this. The prosecutor say, thank you very much for your opinion. Here's a grand jury subpoena. Here's a search warrant. Here's an indictment. I, as prosecutor, get to determine what is appropriate and not appropriate, generally speaking. In respect of the mandate, it's a different question because he has to act within the terms of the mandate. My expectation is that if Mueller is in fact inquiring of the President's private sector financial dealings, and there's a lot of literature out there which speculates that the President may well have received money from Russian oligarchs and even Russian organized crime in the sale of his high-end property during the aftermath of the financial crisis. And in fact, poor kid, Don Jr. gave a speech in 2008 when he was asked at a real estate convention, I think he was asked, well, who banks you these days? How are you getting money to do what you do? And he said, essentially, we don't need banks, we've got the Russians. That's what he was quoted as saying. And Eric Trump, though he has denied it, Trump Jr. couldn't because it was on record, said when asked by a golf organization about how do they get the money for their golf courses, he said Russians. So both kids have said Russian. So the thought is, that is something that Mueller would be interested in. And that could be something that arises out in the course of his investigation. He's investigating collusion. He's investigating how is it that the President of the United States comes to know these people? How do they form a collusive relationship? And Mueller says, what is the predicate for that? And he says, you know what? Maybe it's this earlier financial activity. Maybe when they did all these deals, they formed a bond and they say, all right, that worked out pretty well. Let's now win a presidential election. If that were the theory under which Mueller was to be operating, then I think it would be within his mandate to look at it. However, I think that he would most likely go to the Deputy Attorney General and say, what do you want me to do about this? Remember we talked about how the Deputy Attorney General doesn't really day-to-day run Mueller's investigation. He can fire him for good cause. He gives him his budget, but pretty much day-to-day he's left alone because they are running parallel to, but separate from, the Justice Department. Mueller, I think, would go to Rosenstein and say, what do you want me to do with this? Do you want the tax division of the Justice Department to take up the question of whether the president evaded taxes as a private citizen or engaged in criminal money laundering conspiracies with oligarchs? And Rosenstein will say what he wants. Typically, we saw this in Whitewater, where it was an investigation of a small Arkansas land deal, and it ended up with a blue dress with a stain, and Monica Lewinsky. That expanded exponentially because the prosecutor goes to in that case, the court, and said, what do you want me to do with it? And mostly they say, you're in the process of developing all this evidence for the sake of continuity and time, carry on. That's typically what happens, and that's what I expect would happen here if that is what Mueller has up his sleeve. And some people suggest it. There's an interesting report, if you guys are interested in this money laundering theory, that the Center for American Progress just published 2 days ago. You go to the Center for American Progress website, there's this big 30, 40 page report on Trump and the allegations of his dealings with Russian organized crime and other money to keep his businesses afloat, going all the way back to the 1990s.
Thank you. And I don't feel too badly for Dopey Donnie Jr. because Daddy's just going to pardon him, right?
Well, that's a very good question.
I'm done.
There is, I just say one thing about that, which was a clever way to leave the microphone, but also a very good segue into, if the president is under obstruction of justice inquiry, can he preemptively pardon people to prevent them from testifying against him? And if he does, is that further evidence of abuse of office? So this whole issue of who can he pardon, aside from himself, which is unclear constitutionally, he can pardon anybody else a federal crime. If he does that corruptly, is that further evidence of obstruction of justice or abuse of office? And it's not an easy question to answer.
So I'm gonna go to Mike 3, and look out for that guy, because he might ask you a math question.
I don't see him, he's behind the pole.
No math questions. Actually, that was gonna be my question about Trump's son being pardoned. But for abuse of power, do you know whether there has been any investigation into whether Trump properties like Mar-a-Lago charged the government inflated prices, enriching Trump, and would that be a violation?
So there has been lawsuits brought and lawsuits dismissed so far, I think on appeal now, on this emoluments clause. You can't enrich yourself in office. And some have suggested that, in fact, that is what Trump is doing, both with his hotels and with Mar-a-Lago. If you notice, whenever he goes any place to play golf or otherwise, it's always at a Trump property, and Secret Service agents that travel with him have to rent the carts from the club, and it's incredibly expensive. I forget, the city of Palm Beach, I think, was saying it was like costing him $1 million a day in police overtime and expenses whenever the president went to Mar-a-Lago. You can fact check that number, but it was causing them great budget strain. And so there is a lot of people who think that there is, sort of self-dealing in respect of the Trump presidency and its private properties, but I don't know that amounts to a crime, more an ethical issue that the Office of Professional Responsibility and the White House Ethics Office needs to address itself. They've
And
hired
possibly an impeachable offense, right? But it doesn't seem like there's any federal statute or criminal, there's no Title 18 issue there.
No, not that I can think of. And the only thing that would have to be would be a bribe or a gratuity. So it'd have to show something that you're doing in return for something else. I hope that answered the question.
So I'm gonna go to Dean Latham, and then I'm gonna go to Christopher. Okay, so Mike 1.
Oh, thank you. I have to correct a very serious factual error you
Wait,
made.
excuse me, you did not announce who you are.
I'm Mark Latham. I'm no longer dean on the faculty, but
Oh, right, sorry, Dean Latham, you're no longer a dean.
and the very serious factual error, it wasn't Mrs. McGillicuddy's cow who kicked over the land, it was Mrs. O'Leary's cow.
O'Leary.
Yeah. So, but,
Well, thank you very much for having me.
and I'm from Chicago, but I was gonna mention.
What did McGillicuddy do? She's something.
Perfectly innocent.
Maybe she was from Three Stooges. That's where she was.
But I was gonna make a
Little
prediction
Rascals.
that when Mueller's done, he gets a bunch of indictments, and then isn't Trump going to just pardon him, and that's that. So that's my prediction
Well,
as
yeah.
how this is gonna play out.
It could, except if you're Mueller and you say, I am essentially going to, he notifies his lawyers that he believes that a serious criminal act has occurred and that here are the witnesses, Flynn and Papadopoulos and Gates and others who are now going to testify. And the president says, fine, you're all pardoned. I can't help but think that would be a corrupt purpose and would be, with maybe a different Congress, would be actionable. It's in his power as long as it's federal. If there's a state crime, he can't pardon anyone for state crimes. And there are questions as to the question that you asked about money laundering. Eric Schneiderman, the Attorney General for the state of New York, is got, they say, active grand jury investigations for violations of New York state law, state money laundering, and other financial crimes laws, for fear that if something was done to impact the Mueller investigation or to issue pardons, that state action would be immune from interference by a federal executive.
Excuse me, Michael, we have some other breaking news. Oh, sorry. Are you game?
Yeah, sure.
This is what your life is like, though, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't you envy it?
So according to exclusive from NBC, although this happened earlier today, someone just showed it to me. Apparently, Steve Bannon spent 20 hours in conversation with Mueller's team.
Yeah. So yesterday, the day before yesterday, the media was staking out Mueller's offices, waiting for Bannon to show, and he showed. And so the expectation was that he wasn't going there for any reason other than to give testimony. And the interesting question about Bannon is, what does he have to say that's factual? He's got a lot of opinions. We've seen that in the Fire and Fury book. Remember, he's the one, to your question again, he's the one who said all roads lead through money laundering. And so I think Mueller's going to want to say, what do you know about that? What facts do you have to
And with Jared
support
Kushner
that?
and specifically.
And with Jared
right? That's what he
Kushner.
accused, he alleged.
That's right, and he accused the attendees, Manafort particularly, he said in his revised statement. In his initial statement, he said it was Don Jr., but then the president started yelling at him and he thought that he'd lose his Breitbart funding, and so he changed it to Manafort. But he said that June 9th meeting that we spent all that time talking about was treasonous. That's what.
And I think he said Mueller was going to crack Don Jr. like an egg or something like that. But then he said he didn't mean it in a pejorative way. No, I don't think he's. But he backed off some of that.
Could have been hard-boiled egg or something. But that's right. But that's so. The question is, Bannon is coming in. I expect that unlike his testimony before the congressional committees where he asserted a privilege that he didn't possess and refused to answer his questions, that in Mueller's case, he wouldn't dare do that, because if he came in under grand jury subpoena and he asserted a privilege that he doesn't possess, executive privilege or attorney-client privilege or whatever, Mueller will say, fine, let's go to court and we'll see about your contempt, and you can spend up to 12 months in prison for failing to answer my questions. So the important part about Bannon is, what does he know that's provable as opposed to his theories? All right, you've been waiting very patiently.
Christopher,
and you,
Mike too.
And you guarded the door on the way in. So
Yep.
you get to ask 2 questions if you want.
I actually had 2 questions. That's perfect.
I was kidding, really.
I'm not. Well, okay, so my first question is, because it has to do with money laundering, and if I recall correctly, I believe that one of the subpoenas for seizure files was to Deutsche Bank. And if that's the case, will we see any RICO charges potentially on some of the figures in the bank? I know that might be a little attenuated, but my first answer, and then I can ask my second one.
So RICO is a crime, racketeering, influenced, corrupt organization, 18 U.S. Code 1962, I think, is that right? It is what is used against corrupt organizations. Don Corleone and his family would have been charged as a RICO enterprise. Deutsche Bank is not going to be charged as a RICO enterprise.
So then they would specifically just go after officials individually, as you were saying?
So there is a report that grand jury subpoenas have been issued to Deutsche Bank for financial records pertaining to Trump's financial dealings with Deutsche Bank. Don Jr. said in 2008, remember, we don't need banks, we just rely on Russians, especially for our high-end property. That was his full quote, except it was not completely true because they also were getting financing from Deutsche Bank. No one understood why Deutsche Bank was continuing to lend Trump money because he kept failing to repay them. And in fact, in one occasion when he failed to repay them and they were going to bring suit against them, he sued Deutsche Bank, saying that they were going after him for the refund of the money was inappropriate legally because the financial crisis of 2008 was a force majeure, an act of nature that voided his responsibility. There's a lot of chutzpah, as they say where I grew up.
I'm going to just add, Christopher, one thing is that an enterprise can be charged with criminal liability for money
Right.
laundering. You don't need to wrap it in RICO.
Okay.
Right,
okay.
but so to finish the thing, my expectation is that if a Deutsche Bank subpoena was issued, they're asking for Deutsche Bank to provide documents, not that Deutsche Bank is a target of their inquiry in a you could be indicted sense, but rather you possess financial documents that are relevant to our inquiry. That would be my guess. So I don't think Deutsche Bank is in a position of prospective liability for what we know in the paper, but rather they are just a possessor of documents relevant to Mueller's financial crimes inquiry.
Thank you.
Question
Do
two.
you mind that? Is that fine?
That's fine with me.
Okay.
I got nothing to do.
So,
I'm in Berlin. I mean, where am I? I'm South Burlington in the winter. It's dark outside.
My next question is that Donald Trump has obviously stated that he would definitely go under oath, and if there was an interview with Robert Mueller. But my question is that what do you think that in that interview Mueller would be questioning? What was sort of the tactics, or because I know that Trump's lawyers are obviously really guarded as to let him meet with Mueller because they don't want him to say any sort of, I guess, false statements.
Yeah, right. So this is a great question. The question is whether the president will endeavor to resist Mueller's request to sit down and be interviewed under oath. And the simple answer is, I don't believe under the Supreme Court decision of United States versus Nixon and its progeny, there are a couple of Nixon cases that followed that with the GSA and elsewhere, or under this case, in Ray, sealed case, Espy, which is about Agricultural Secretary Espy, which defined the executive privilege, deliberative process, communication process privileges that the president has. I don't believe that he has any likelihood of success in resisting Mueller's grand jury subpoena for him to testify, should Mueller push the envelope. So I think that the answer is, ultimately, here's another prediction you can hold me accountable to when I get it wrong. I don't believe that the President of the United States has the capacity in the face of inquiry by a grand jury to receive its evidence to withhold that evidence, short of its taking the Fifth Amendment. And so I expect that as what happened in Clinton was that they reached a deal where they took Clinton's testimony in the map room of the White House for 9.5 hours, which was piped into the grand jury live, streaming, I guess is the word today. And he answered the questions of the independent counsel without his lawyers present for that period of time. And I think that having taken George Herbert Walker Bush's testimony, my expectation is that Mueller will behave similarly, which is very deferential to the office of the president. You know, it's an important position that is, and but at the same time, notwithstanding the deference to the office, he will defer to his desire to obtain the truth and nothing but the truth, you know, so help you God sort of stuff. And he will not let the interview end until he obtains from the president all that which he needs, including whether it means coming back for a second day. So I think it'll be polite conversation as the president deserves, but direct, and answers will have to be specific enough so that Mueller knows whether they're truth or lies. Because under the laws of the United States, perjury, for example, is a crime that requires a specific question and a specific answer which is untruthful. An answer which is misleading but technically truthful will not support a perjury prosecution. And so he has to ask specific questions and get specific answers, and that's what will be the challenge with the president, who tends to wander a bit in his answers. But I think Mueller and his team are fairly experienced at making sure witnesses. I mean, look, this guy Andrew Weissman, who's on his team, got one of the organized crime figures in New York to flip. He was a hitman for the mob, and he got him to flip and testify against, I think it was the Gambino family. Again, someone like my McGillicuddy versus O'Leary will get me the correct answer of which organized crime family it was. So they know how to interview witnesses.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to South Royalton. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
And Mike, okay, 3, I think we've got 2 more questions, Mike 3 and then Mike 1, unless you're in line too? Yep, 3 questions, great.
My name is Brian Lombardo. I'm not a lawyer.
Sorry,
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Sorry, Brian, before I interrupt you, why don't we get all 3 people to ask their questions, and then you can kind of answer them serially? Or is that too hard for you to remember?
Depends on the questions, I guess.
Okay, no, never mind, let's just do them one by one, it's late. Okay, what, first?
So I'm not a lawyer, but I am old enough to remember Watergate, and can't help but comparing and contrasting the behavior of Devin Nunes with Howard Baker. And I'm a little bit curious, as an aside, but not quite as germane to this conversation tonight, as how we got where we are in terms of the behaviors that we have politically. But secondly, more importantly, is it really possible for Mueller to not have his prosecution and also his recommendations shaped by the political climate? And how might that happen, and how may he nuance things given the intense partisanship that we have going on right now?
That's a great conversation for a very long period of time. The first part. So for those of you who don't remember, Watergate, Howard Baker was the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, and it turned out in the end to be a person of honor, if you will, saying to the President of the United States, this behavior isn't acceptable. And the compare and contrast that the question is trying to pose is, here you have on the one hand a person who realizes that there's impropriety at the highest office in the land, and he says to the president, Mr. President, essentially, it's not acceptable. Compared with the questioner's perspective, which is that Devin Nunes, who's the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, seems to be doing more of the president's bidding. So the politicians say, and I try not to have political opinions about these things, just legal ones, but those who have expressed political opinions, to parrot what they say, is that he's doing the president's bidding rather than being an honest broker of the truth. And isn't that disappointing? And I think that the answer is, if in fact that is what he is doing, it's disappointing, because the notion of separation of powers and congressional oversight demands integrity from all 3 branches of government. And if that's not what we're seeing in the House of Representatives, then they're not fulfilling their constitutional responsibilities. How we got here is just completely beyond me. You'd think that we've, gotten to a place in time where people can cooperate and find consensus around things, but we seem far away from that. Though there is some hope, I think, in respect of this investigation in the Senate, where Senator Warner and Senator Burr, in their committee, Foreign House Senate Intelligence, I think it is, seem to be doing a pretty good job of moving forward through the investigation and trying to figure out what happened here. So it's a sad situation politically from what all the political commenters seem to say. But did I miss the second part of you? Was there another part of the question?
That was regarding whether or not Mueller's.
Oh, how does Mueller not?
The outcome of the Mueller investigation.
How does it?
Not be shaped by that.
Well, that's hard. I mean, we are, as prosecutors, they live in the real world, and they have their own, perspective on things. And the question is, the responsibility of the prosecutor is to make sure that his individual points of view, bias, some call it, but his individual or her individual points of view do not shape the way in which they view the evidence. And Mueller has to work very hard to make sure that he doesn't allow him or anybody on his team to have their personal points of view impact the way they view the evidence. And I have a great deal of confidence in Mueller and the team that he picked. Remember, all of these people that are on Mueller's team were handpicked by him. They're people that he's worked with for long periods of time over the course of his very lengthy career. Remember, we started with who is Bob Mueller, and he's about as experienced as they get, and he brought in about as experienced a team as can be found. And we see the integrity, I think, a bit in, we saw the story about Peter Strzok, the FBI agent, and his paramour, Page, engaged in what was clearly inappropriate communications, where they were talking about how much they didn't like the president and the like. And that guy, Strzok, was on Mueller's team at the outset. He inherited him from the FBI counterintelligence investigation that he picked up. Remember, we talked about that was already ongoing. Mueller gets appointed, that rolls into him. He finds out that the Inspector General is inquiring of Strzok and those emails, and what does Mueller do? He removes them from the case. The first moment he learns that, he removes them from the case. And I don't want anything to do with politics on my investigation. So it's hard, but I think that, as I said, I think the president is quite lucky in having Mueller as a prosecutor if he's done nothing wrong, because he will, to the best of his ability, and I think his abilities are pretty substantial, keep politics out of the conclusions that he draws.
Okay, so back to Mike 1.
Sure. My name's Dominic. I'm a first-year law student here. And given the chance that, I don't know what the odds are that there isn't a groundbreaking indictment handed down from the Mueller investigation, could you possibly see, if Democrats win back the House and Senate in 2018 midterms, that they prematurely jump the gun after suffering arguably the biggest political upset of all time and not having control of Congress since 2010, that they prematurely offer articles of impeachment to President Trump, and not knowing how long the Mueller investigation can drag on for? Do you see that as a possibility?
Well, I don't know. My most heartfelt answer is I surely hope not. That would not be how we'd want the government to run. I would think that if there is a change of power in the House in particular, that there may be greater pace or something like that brought to the oversight investigations, which might lead to articles of impeachment. But I really don't think that will be the way it works. I think that whoever controls the House is going to let Mueller define the behavior that is either criminal or abuse of power, that they're not going to preempt him. That's my hope. Again, we can put down on the list of things that I'll get wrong when I come back. When I come back in the spring and you'll say, well, you predicted this, you were wrong, you predicted that, you were wrong. So I may well be wrong, but my hope is that they wouldn't do that, and they'd let Mueller, who's got the most insight into what's going on here, make his referral to the Deputy Attorney General in his final report and let them decide whether that is. Because remember, the Deputy Attorney General, when he gets the report, is to share it with Congress. And so Congress gets the report, and it's upon that, I think, that they should make a determination of whether or not there's been an abuse of power, abuse of office.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
And, well, actually, I'm going to have the women there come to the mic, because no women have spoken, I noticed yet, so please, you, and then...
No, that's not true. There was a woman back there.
Oh, we had one woman,
Hey,
thank you.
everyone.
Sorry.
A quick question. What is, if Mueller is questioning Trump and he says, I plead the fifth?
That's his right.
And then how does that roll out? And why would he and why wouldn't he, please?
Well, I think, first, it is the right of everyone to plead the Fifth Amendment. Now, you can go to court and challenge whether or not there is actually something that is behind the Fifth Amendment that the person who asserts it is trying to protect. You can't improperly assert, tell me your name, I assert the Fifth. You know, where do you live? I assert. At some point, those things are sort of challengeable, but assuming that the president asserts the Fifth Amendment properly, that's his right to do so, and the consequence of it, I think, principally are political, not legal. That's what I think. I mean, for a person who has spent the last year saying no collusion, and now no collusion and no obstruction, because they told him you have to say both, it's hard for him to say, and now I'm taking the fifth. I think that's a very difficult position for a person to be in politically, except to the extent that they are able to have Mueller's investigation be seen to be so political itself, which is what you see. A lot of the attacks on the Mueller investigation to make it appear to be political and a witch hunt is so that if the president were to take the fifth or do something like that, he could say, the only reason I did it is not because I did anything wrong, but because that's a witch hunt and I'm not going to cooperate with it. And then he has to still deal with the political consequences, or whether Mueller decides, notwithstanding him taking the fifth, he's going to, you know, make a referral or file an indictment or whatever. But I think it's mostly political.
Thank you.
Last question?
Take this off. Before I go, this is primarily for students, and I'm a citizen and resident of the town. Are there any other students who have questions? Because I don't really want to preempt them.
It's all yours.
It's all yours.
Well, thank you. My name's Tim Dreisbach. I'm just a citizen and resident of the town. I'm not affiliated with a law school, and I'm not a lawyer. I would like to do two things.
All good things so far.
Well, my son is a criminal prosecutor, as you are, so.
Okay.
I'd like to, first of all, address a few comments to the students who are here, and then where actually I may disagree with our speaker, and then I have a question for the
Well, actually,
question for the speaker.
I'm sorry, I'm the moderator here, and students didn't come here to be asked questions, so.
No, it's not a question.
I'm sorry, we need questions and not comments, so if you can we're opening this to questions, so if you can ask a question to the speaker, that would be great.
Okay, well, I have three questions that are specific to students, and then, which will be very quick ones, and then a fourth one that is directed to you.
I really want you just to ask one question of the speaker. That's what, thanks.
Are you aware of this week's Politico column by William Yeomans, who was at the Justice Department in charge of the Civil Rights Division, who said Mueller would be crazy to issue a subpoena?
Against whom?
For Trump. That Mueller will not issue a subpoena to the president, and he'd be crazy to do so.
The president to testify? You mean
Yes.
for the president to testify?
Under subpoena.
Well, no, I haven't seen that.
I would encourage you and people to read that.
And I expect that Mueller's position would be, as was the position of most of the other independent counsels that preceded him, which is it's much better to work out an agreement to obtain the testimony than to subpoena the president. But If the president refuses to cooperate and he feels that the grand jury needs to hear his testimony, then he has no choice but to subpoena. So it's within the president's control whether he receives a subpoena or not, is my view.
Okay, I'll skip my second question for time.
Actually, we're also, that was the last question of the
All right.
evening. Thank you so much. So I want us all to give a nice
Or
round of applause.
I don't get my other question?
Ask me afterwards.
Hello? Excuse me.
The event is over now, so please, if you want to ask individual questions to the speaker, please come up afterward. Thank you so much for a wonderful evening.
It's just late. It's late.